Ohayou gozaimasu. Good morning, everybody. After yesterday's spectacular opening here, we have another spectacular event this morning. The first plenary speaker of that conference, Dr. Anuradha Annaswamy, and we can very much look forward to that. My name is Frank Allgauer. I'm from the University of Stuttgart, and I was asked to chair this plenary session. Let me first introduce Dr. Annaswamy. She's from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. She is the founder and director of the Active Adaptive Control Lab there, and also associated with the Mechanical Engineering Department. Her background is originally, she's from India, and she got her undergraduate degrees from the Indian Institute of Sciences in Bangalore. Then she went to the United States and got her PhD degree from Yale University with Narendra, if I know that correctly. And then she had faculty positions at Yale, Boston University, and then at MIT. She's very famous for her work on adaptive control, and it's not in the title today, but I'm pretty sure somewhere we will see some adaptive control input, some adaptive control results here. And she is not only developing the theory of adaptive control, but applying it to a very wide selection of application areas, including the topics of today: smart grids, power grids, smart cities, and so on. Dr. Annaswamy has many, many awards, way too many to mention here, but I still want to mention a couple of them. So, for example, the NSF Young Investigator Award. She's a fellow of IEEE and of IFAC. She has several Best Paper Awards, the George Exelby Award, the Control Systems Magazine Best Paper Award. She also has distinctions from other countries. For example, she is a distinguished alumni of IISc, and she got a very prestigious award from Germany, the Fischer Award from the Technical University of Munich, from the Institute of Advanced Study, for a fellowship of being there. So she is really very well known to everybody. She also serves the community quite a bit, so not only by doing research, but she has been the president of the Control Systems Society, and she's very active in contributing to vision papers, to vision awards, roadmap papers. One we will see this week also. I believe it's on Wednesday, right? Today, which is, maybe you probably announce it yourself, the special session that we have there. So, without further ado, the title you can read yourself, Dr. Anuradha Annaswamy.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Frank, for that really humbling introduction. And I'd like to thank Hajime for inviting me to give this plenary. I'm honored and privileged to not only speak here in front of you, to be the first plenary speaker of this really wonderful conference. And I hope that you get to enjoy all of the sessions that follow, and hopefully this presentation as well. I'm not sure if I will have anything to say about adaptive control in this talk, but I'll try. So it's hard for me to keep me from, I guess, bringing up adaptation one way or another. But what I do want to share with you is the topic of power grids that I've been working on, which Frank mentioned is one of the applications that we've been involved in our group, and specifically resilience and distributed decision making. So question is, what's the problem? Well, this actually was in the news just last week. So the Earth recorded its hottest day since the records began, and so it jumped from 16.9 degrees Celsius to 17.2. And that's the CNN announcement that you see in the top left. And what you see in the top right is an announcement from Australia that basically recorded the heat map across the Earth. And what you see below is from the Weather Authority that talks about the air and water temperatures around the Earth. So clearly there is a problem. And in fact, if you take a step back and look at how the temperature has been changing over a millennia, so you can see that there is a very clear gradient upwards. And the biggest bumps really come in the context of industrial revolution and as the world starts to globalize. And you can see the gradients in the last decade especially accelerate in an extreme manner and in a troublesome manner. Hence, it's no longer a climate change issue that we're dealing with, but climate crisis. And why is it happening? Well, it's happening because of greenhouse gas emissions, and various sectors in the industrialized world are contributing to it. But the one that I will focus on is basically energy supply, which is power generation, how electricity is generated and brought to you and me. So as an effort in trying to decarbonize, the electricity grid has been actually looking quite a bit about how we can move away from fossil-based resources. And here's just a sample of some of the countries that basically has been announcing various projections as to how to achieve this target of deep decarbonization. So the picture that you have in the top right is what Japan's numbers, and again, this might be even dated, and it's quite likely that they're being even more ambitious than what those numbers suggest. And so the whole idea, as you can see, the green sliver, I know it's hard for you to read all of the different numbers, the green sliver denotes renewables, and you can see that the green is gradually increasing as you move towards 2030. And the same thing in Australia, and so there too you can see a very similar push, and this is China, and what I have in the bottom left is from Canada. And so closer to home, United States, there are things that are actually even more aggressive, and here's again some of the states that are announcing various targets, and the numbers are almost always 100% renewables. So Los Angeles, for instance, has this fairly aggressive target, and so does Hawaii, makes sense, but there are many other states around the country that basically are pushing towards 100% clean electricity. So, this is a fairly ambitious target, and so in order to figure out how to get there, let's sort of take a step back and see how we got here. So way back, Edison lost the war of currents, as it's called, to Tesla and Westinghouse. So alternating current, AC, became the way in which electricity was delivered. And so what was done was that all of the polluting sources of electricity based on coal, based on oil, were like moved away from the urban centers, and they used long transmission lines to basically deliver the electricity with a lot of step down, and it reached you and me. So the question is then, for this, with this kind of a power generation, which is very much a part of electricity delivery, and the power grid is an engineering marvel. So how do you actually change this and move the needle towards renewables? And that's a big challenge in itself. So now let's think about what exactly is the footprint of control in the context of this power delivery. So basically, there are what are known as load-serving entities. You predict the demand, and you basically have generation meet demand. So that's one of the cardinal rules that you have to meet in order to have reliable power electricity. So there is a market entity that basically decides who generates how much power optimally, and then the bulk generation basically provides the set points to the generators, and then that comes through the transmission system that manages congestion, and then basically the rest of it is a passive appendage where there's a whole series of steps, but there are some switches that do some controls, but otherwise it's basically coming down to the distribution system and then down to you and me. So that's it, that's how the pieces come together. Now, this jigsaw puzzle is now changing significantly as you want to green the electricity generation. So now you've got renewables, and they have to talk to all of the other entities properly. You have demand response, which is the notion of flexible consumption, and you have storage. You have to fill the valleys whenever the sun doesn't shine or wind doesn't blow. And you have power electronics provide an interface between DC, which is the source at which solar power comes in, to AC, and you need microgrids, which again is sort of a microcosm of how electricity, providing oversight, shall we say, of various kinds of key parameters in the grid, and of course electric vehicles, which are storage on wheels. Now, all of these have to come together. And so now you can see that the cyber footprint is increasing as you increase more and more of these devices. And the other thing is that the sheer number. So if you really think about every little water heater and EV in our homes and HVAC and give them smarts, then you have 7 billion devices that basically are capable of making decisions. And so one of the challenges, the new challenge that is introduced because of this, is basically cyber attacks. So given these open windows of communication, there are open windows of vulnerability, and all of those become basically an opportunity for adversaries to basically create trouble. And so this kind of a cyber attack can occur at all of the communication points at the bulk level. But just to sort of, given that you keep increasing the footprint, you can see that there is so much that can happen at the device level between all of the different communication entities. So needless to say that this is a big problem. It becomes even bigger simply because the power system is a very large-scale system. The decision-making has to occur over a range of time scales, which goes all the way from microseconds to decades. And at all of these timescales, decisions have to be made, and we have to manage 7 to 8 billion smart devices. And therefore, we really need to figure out how the grid can be designed to be resilient to not just these natural anomalies that we keep hearing again and again, which are also increasing in intensity and frequency, but also cyber anomalies. So that really is the problem that I'd like to address today. So I hope I've convinced you that this is indeed a very, very difficult problem, a very topical problem, a very urgent problem. And like we do in any kind of a control design journey, we try to model it. We try to put our arm around what exactly is the type of attack that can occur. So let's start there. So if you think about cyber attacks or any kind of attack, if you trace the origins to where some of these concepts really came, it really is associated, which makes a lot of sense, connected with warfare. So there is an attacker perspective, there is a defender perspective, and the terminologies that have come to be used in this topic is basically that. That from a defender perspective, you can have various kinds of breaches. There's one of confidentiality, there's one of integrity and availability. This is from a defender perspective. From an attacker perspective, this basically says that they can eavesdrop, that's a disclosure. They can corrupt the signals, that's deception. They can actually block it or they can delay it, and all of those are disruption. So now let's map all of that into our very familiar feedback control. And so you can see that where the points of vulnerability are wherever we are providing a cyber window. So that could be either at the sensors or the network computation layer or the actuator layer, and of all kinds, disclosure, deception, or disruption. So now let's take a look at some of the examples, and there's been so many papers written, and I apologize in advance that I might not be able to, if I've not mentioned your paper, that is a complete oversight on my part, but definitely not intended. But let me just walk you through an example of those kinds of cyber attacks that actually happen in the context of power grid. So here is one that is known as a replay attack at transmission grid. And frequency information, for instance, is a very crucial one that basically has to be conveyed between one area and another. So this information, the frequency information, has to come from here to here, because there's this thing known as AGC, which is a fantastic illustration of integral control. And so what it does is it basically, by communicating this information, provides a way of correcting the offset, the steady state error, and bring it back to zero. And it works beautifully across this large scale. So now if you really mess up and you change the information, so obviously if the frequency here is not this, and you've replayed it to really confuse the operator, then you're in trouble. So that's one of the biggest examples where replay attacks basically have been looked at in the context of transmission grids. Another one is basically to, here we go into deception and not just disclosure. And so here, the set points are attacked. And why are the set points? Well, you just set points attacked by the attacker in a way so that the attacker continues to remain stealthy. So usually there is a notion of a residue, which we all employ in many other control problems. And so the attacker basically deliberately designs the corruption in a way so that he or she continues to remain stealthy, and the whole purpose is to make profit before detection. In fact, they can do this in a very optimal way and really solve their own little optimization problem and say, here is the cost that you want to maximize, and you want to remain stealthy. You don't want to trigger any of the congestion limits, and how do you do that? And you basically make a lot of profit at the end of the day. So this is another kind of what is known as a false data injection attack, which is one of deception. Now, as you start thinking about mixing and matching many of these sort of conceptual ways of affecting the system, very easily the problem becomes very complicated. So here is one, which is which is actually more of a thought experiment, and I'll keep returning to this throughout the talk, is known as manipulation of demand using IoT devices, which has the very unfortunate acronym of MAD-IoT. So what is done here is that over time, there's a lot of monitoring that goes on. They enter the system surreptitiously, and then they identify the most vulnerable nodes and instance. And then not only that, they compromise the most vulnerable high wattage devices, and a large number of them. And enough so that they really, again, remain stealthy, and the operator, by the time they detect that something is going on, it's too little, too late. And this is a combination of disclosure and deception attack. Another one, and this is actually even bigger in scale, and it's a combination of disclosure, deception, and disruption. And what they really did is to introduce a malware using spearfish attacks. They basically then stole the identity. Then they targeted key control centers. So the Negros are basically distribution companies. And all of the about 250,000 customers lost power for about 6 hours. And so there were about 75 mega hour of energy that basically was disrupted. And so not only that, the key center that they attacked was the one that basically responded to outages to customers. So customers couldn't even report as to what was going on in their neighborhood. So it was really a targeted attack, and obviously there was country's politics was involved in it, but whatever the reason might be, the idea here is that these attacks become more and more complex as you go, because again, they're using these different kinds of concepts that I mentioned to you are part of the attack model. So the takeaway here basically is that these cyber attacks are large in number, they evolve, and they adapt. Oh, I did use the word adapt. And then not only that, these attacks actually occur in various ways. These are not just thought experiments. They actually have been reported by the MITRE, where they did a very large analysis, and there's really showed that there were very large number of attack techniques that can be employed and that have been employed, and this has been cataloged. So this goes to say that show that the problem is really indeed real. So now that we have a sense of the magnitude of the problem and specifically the magnitude of the attacks, let's see what is it that control can do in this context. And there have been any number of approaches that have been proposed. And again, just like I showed you in the context of attack, let's try to put our arm around it as to what the concepts are, the control concepts, the systems concepts people have used in order to address it. And I would broadly put this into 3 different categories. One is all of which has to do with that picture that you see, that you're trying to squish the area that is shaded down to 0. And you do that by basically attacking it from all 3 sides, right? So the leftmost side basically talks about prevention mechanisms. So what you try to do is either you prevent completely the attack from occurring by having some sort of a mechanism, or you basically try to delay the onset of the attack. So that is one of the class of problems. And if you think about it, cybersecurity, the oldest and the first layer of defense that people use belongs to this category, where you basically make it difficult for the attacker to eavesdrop, to get confidential information. And you do that by basically introducing encryption, and you basically make sure that you protect the key and you don't transmit that, so that you cannot easily, the eavesdropper, by looking at it, cannot easily extract sensitive information. So that's a sort of a prevention mechanism. Another one that's been used actually and in the context of wide area power systems is to again have a bit of a masking by deliberately randomizing the data that is communicated. So for instance, in the consensus dynamics, you deliberately introduce noise, and that helps preserve privacy and does not lend itself to disclosure attacks. So another kind of, again, this is only an example, and there are lots and lots of such efforts that have been expended very successfully in this context. At the other end, what you try to do is to basically detect the attack and isolate the attacker so that you can then basically recover quickly. So the attacker you might not have had a chance to prevent them, but at least you're trying to recover from the attack quickly. So that's why pushing the area from this to the right. And so here, one of the examples is to say, okay, I now have this extraordinarily powerful attacker, and the attacker knows everything. They have access to the model, they have access to the sensors, they have access to the actuators. And so in that case, it really becomes very difficult because they can basically attack the system both at the sensor side and at the actuator side, so that they basically are deliberately masking whatever they've done here and not allowing the processing to basically capture that corrupted information. So what this is about is basically using the notion of baiting honeypot. Those are different tools that have used moving target defense, where you deliberately introduce some obfuscation in the system data so that whatever they try to do is system identification by looking at the data really is not that easy. And by doing that, they basically make the attacker reveal themselves. So this is another kind of detection isolation mechanism. There is also a lot of learning-based methods for anomaly detection to say, okay, there is a usual benchmark, and then you look at that benchmark to say, if you have things that really that exceed the threshold, you know that there is some sort of anomaly detection. But the thing to keep in mind is that in a large-scale system, we need to distinguish between two things. An attack detection may be possible, but that doesn't mean that you can detect the attacker because of the system being really large. So let's try to keep the distinction in mind. The detection in isolation especially is not possible. You might be able to know that, hey, something is wrong, but you don't know exactly what went wrong, especially in a large-scale system. So something to keep in mind. So the last kind of tools that have been employed are resilience mechanisms. So let's be agnostic to, either maybe an attack occurs or maybe it doesn't occur, but we'll try to contain the damage. We'll try to minimize the amount of damage. Can we do that in some way? And so that really is the notion of resilience mechanisms in here. So, and one of the tools that has been used a lot is basically to use design defense strategies by having the possible set of actions and making sure that there is an optimal cyber policy that basically figures out what exactly is the worst thing that the attacker can do and have the defender basically prevent that. I'm not going to say much more. Tamir Bashara is going to have a plenary later in this conference, and do come to that, and I'm sure there's a lot more that you're going to learn about exactly how this should be done. Another thing is to say that here's how you can build resilience. After all, it's all about communication and eavesdropping and then using that information to corrupt it in some way. Why not really make it difficult for them to figure out when you're going to communicate? So randomize the communication. So take an interval, but within that, you actually uniformly distribute the actual time over which you're going to communicate. And that basically also is another one. This is a very interesting idea where, again, you don't worry too much about the topology or the information that you have about the attacker, but you use a sort of a consensus approach, and you basically ignore outliers, whether they're very large or very small, so that you're at least containing the damage that is introduced by the attacker. And so this is something that has actually been used extensively in many different applications, including power systems, and in the context of distributed optimization, in the context of federated learning. This is a specific tool called SparseFed, and this too has been very successful. Another one is event-triggered control, where you just, again, minimize the amount of time that you execute control, not necessarily in a periodical manner, but only as and when needed. And that also minimizes the vulnerability to the amount of windows that you're opening up to attack, and you use a Lyapunov-like function to determine the triggering instances. Trust-based approach is, again, a very powerful tool where you essentially appeal to redundancies, and you have lots and lots of sensors and that provide independent information, and you leverage trusted components to increase the resiliency. So you develop some sort of a metric, and you keep updating it as and when you get new data about how that particular component is evolving, and you rely on those with a high amount of trustability metric. And so the whole idea is that if you have more uncorrupted information that sort of dominates corrupted information, then you can do better. And so this is another kind of thing. So, okay, now let's take all of these things and apply it to the attacks that I mentioned before and see what people have done in order to mitigate the attacks. So let me start with the first one, the transmission grid. Remember I said the replay attacks? So here, remember the whole thing was, the frequency information was obfuscated. And so essentially what was done in this particular case is actually very clever, that they used this watermarking idea where deliberately signals were corrupted. And all of that information basically was processed in some way, and the stochastic information takes multiple paths, and then you evaluate both of those paths, and if there is a certain kind of relationship that is maintained, you know that there is no attacker. So that lends itself to a detection metric, and what they were able to show was that that detection metric basically, in the context of a replay attack, was significant, and that basically led to the fact that there was some sort of an attack, and they were able to then take steps to mitigate it. So this was very successful in the context of replay attacks. Let's go back to the markets part, and here too, the idea is something very similar, where you use a trust-based approach, where you basically keep in mind that you make the attacker reveal themselves so that you don't really allow the residue to become small, to remain small rather. And so you do that by introducing additional measurements, and those additional measurements basically reveal the attacker. And so that's what they did in this context, and was very successful for resilience against false data injection attacks. Now, all of these tools, while they're fantastic, there's still more to be done in the context of a large-scale attack. And remember I mentioned to you about Mad IoT attack, where devices were corrupted at the lower end. And this it's a combination of disclosure and deception, and it really is a challenging problem. The second one that I mentioned to you about the Ukraine attack is also challenging, because not only were the devices, the loads affected, but they also took a lot of trouble to corrupt the operators themselves at the higher levels. And because of the complexity of the corruption that was involved, and it's a combination, for instance, of not only disclosure and deception, but also disruption, that also makes it a very challenging problem. So what I'm going to now basically do is to figure out what is it that we can do, and that really is the rest of the talk that says, how do we actually address these large-scale problems? Because in the context of something like the power grid, remember I told you that there is lots and lots of assets that are dispatchable, that are capable of making decisions. Now, these devices are all not really owned by the same company. It's not always utility owned, and some of them are privately owned. And so you need to, some of them are publicly owned, and you need to therefore have a way in which you can leverage all of that information. And keep in mind now that these disparate devices can be attacked either at the device end, or they can be attacked at the source, at the operator end. And so how do you then really figure out a way of dealing with this complexity, not only of scale, but also disparity? And so that's really is another kind of challenge. And so both of these attacks that I mentioned to you, which is difficult to really find resilience mechanisms and other kinds of control solutions, how can you basically address those two? And the approach that we're going to propose is one of distributed decision-making. And the distributed decision-making, the first step is to really not only have multiple entities that basically provide oversight, but also those decision makers basically have to have some kind of a visibility as to, hey, what's going on? Maybe not that we can identify the attacker, but at least identify the attack. And we're going to propose the use of a market framework in order to do that. So that basically is the next topic here that I'd like to go towards, and that is, how do you utilize electricity markets to make decisions and leverage the notion of trustability? Now, electricity markets really are all about determining set points. They do it in an optimal way. They do there's known as, in the United States, for instance, there's a thing called independent system operator, known by different names in different parts of the world. They do many things, but the most important thing that is of relevance to this talk is set points. They calculate set points, all right? So now let's just have a very different kind of a take on this. Instead of having this decision-making only at the bulk level, we start here from the transmission grid, and then we go to a whole bunch of step downs at various levels. And so these are higher voltage levels. And so you step down to a primary feeder, to a secondary feeder, and all our homes are connected over here. So some of these are large loads that are connected, like large industrial processes, campuses, whereas homes are basically connected more over here. And the proposal that we are introducing in here is you basically have a whole bunch of operators who provide this oversight. And so, for instance, you're going to have some at the primary level, and that starts with a distribution system operator who right now, there is such a thing in the US, but they have more reliability kinds of things of oversight by monitoring voltages and such, but really don't have a market kind of a functionality. But that's what we are proposing here. And we can also, as you go further down, primary market operator who basically sits here and supervises a whole bunch of primary market agents who are sitting at all of these nodes. And remember, these could be large industrial processes themselves, or they could be an aggregated entity that basically looks at everything that is below, including all of our loads and rooftop generation that might be sitting, et cetera. So now let's talk about how do you actually make a distributed decision. So remember, we said, we really do the functionality of the market is to not only determine who produces how much power, but they do it optimally. So there is an optimization problem to be solved. And when you have a large scale, like something like 1 million or millions, then it becomes really difficult. And so you have to distribute that computation and parallelize it, which is really what we do in here. There is always constraints, and you're trying to minimize some sort of a cost. And what you do is you basically partition the problem, and you assign different kinds of complexity to the distributed solvers by having copies. And these copies basically make sure that you can, in an atomized way, you can solve an individual problem, many of these atoms in parallel, and make sure that all of these copies basically converge to the true value by satisfying the constraint. And that basically ensures, as you ensure feasibility, you ensure that these copies indeed approach the true value. So for instance, if you take an example like this, where you have a constraint, then you know that Y1 is talking to Y2, and therefore you have a copy of Y2 here, and Y2 is talking to Y3 and Y4, and you repeat that process, and having all of these copies converge to the true values included in this adjacency constraint. So that basically is what is done in this algorithm that we have developed, known as proximal atomic coordination. And you do introduce some sort of a regularization to make sure that indeed you can solve the primal variable and the dual variable in an efficient manner. And we can show that indeed there is convergence under convexity assumptions, and indeed your primal variable converges to the true value. But the nice thing about it is not just convergence, you can also show that the data remains private. Remember, we have to accommodate the fact that there are multiple owners, and these multiple owners really do not want to reveal sensitive information. So we introduce another layer of update, and that basically has extra gains that are basically time varying and are not known to the outside world, and therefore you're able to not reveal the sensitive information about operating constraints. And so you have a masked dual variable that is exchanged, and that's sort of the advantage over, say, for instance, the DADMM that might be more familiar to many of you. So we then took this and we employed it and tested it in a large-scale example. There's an IEEE 123 node, and you've got basically a lot of different nodes in here. And we assume that all amount of nodes have certain amount of flexibility, and there is enough distributed energy resources that are sitting in some of these nodes. And then we started with this kind of a boundary condition of what's coming from the bulk grid, and we were able to have individually all of these different nodes produce different power and get compensated for it appropriately, both in time and in space, both in the real power and the reactive power, which was really important. So this says that at the end of the day, this market structure, it's just markets. We're not really saying anything about resilience yet, and here is the connection between the two. What we're saying here is that the primary market operator has oversight, he has visibility over what each of these agents are producing. So they have some amount of awareness, and that is basically what we're calling as IoT coordinated assets, ICA, at the primary node, and that is basically the active and the reactive power. And that basically is the visibility, the situational awareness that I'm talking about. So that's the first step in dealing with a large-scale problem, and at the same time provide oversight locally so that you know what's happening within your own jurisdiction, which is something that all large institutions, large organizations typically do. And so we are proposing the same thing for the power grid as well, as you increase the amount of distributed energy resources. So now, remember that this is a big problem, large-scale system. The primary node is not where it ends. It starts there, maybe even. So all of these primary market agents are also secondary market operators themselves. So if you now zoom in some more and really actually look at what's happening to each of these SMOs, they basically have their own kind of further decision-making to do. There are a bunch of secondary market agents who are basically providing oversight over maybe smart buildings, maybe EV parks, individual homes, rooftop solars, and they have to then determine who's producing what and getting compensated in what way. And that brings in another layer of complexity, where now this guy is sitting between somebody at the top who's making decisions, and they have to talk to the customers. They're closer to the customers in the right way. So then we have appropriate timescales here, and not only do we have the whole process of bidding and clearing, but we also introduce a certain amount of flexibility in how much you can generate. So what we do in here is to say, okay, you really need to also be willing to provide not only an amount of power generation, but anywhere in that range. The same thing applies for flexible consumption as well. Let's say that you have a whole bunch of HVACs, and you have flexibility in when you're using that load, and that flexible consumption, or you have AC, and you're willing to adjust the set point, and by willing to adjust the set point and living with 25 degrees or 26 degrees centigrade instead of 21, then you basically consume less in a hot and humid day like this, and that gives you a way, that helps out the operator in terms of giving them an opportunity to have resilience, and you'll see how I leverage this at the later point in this talk. So that's what we do with the secondary market in here. There are a lot more things that really I'm going to show you here. And so this is the cleared solution, and that provides with this flexibility. But let's go a little bit further to see how we solve this optimization problem. Here, too, there is a cost function. And there is a whole bunch of objectives that you have to accommodate, because you have to accommodate reliability, you have to minimize, you have to pay your customers, right, for generating. And then you have to basically, for consuming. You have to pay your agents who are generating. You have to collect revenue from your customers who are consuming. And at the end of the day, you want to minimize that cost. You want to maximize the flexibility in what kind of generation that you're producing. And you also want to minimize disutility, the comfort for your customers. So all of these are accommodated. So on the whole, while the top layer worried more about power physics and power flow constraints, like power balance constraints, as you go further down, you have to worry more about what the customers really pay attention to and what are their customer preferences and idiosyncrasies, and that's what you do in your secondary market. So you accommodate all these kinds. Now comes the whole issue of resilience. Remember that these are owned by a whole bunch of people or agencies or entities, and not always utility owned. So you have to be able to trust them. You have to make sure that they will provide, you can count on them when the time comes for resilience. That basically is what this is about. So this says that there is a resilience score that we're going to attach to each of these agents. And how do you actually calculate it? Well, you're going to have a combination of commitment. When you say, I'm going to reduce the consumption, do you actually do it? Or you say, not today. So then that particular consumer is not committed to doing their job. And the other aspect of it is basically trustability. So this is the commitment score, and this is the trustability score. And you calculate the commitment score by basically, you reward them for fulfilling their contract, and you penalize violations. So you basically look at what's the actual amount of injection that they are going to provide compared to what they've been cleared for, and you monitor that, and that is this number here. Then you basically normalize them so that you're dealing with a non-dimensional quantity, and that is what you utilize in order to update the score. So if C is 1, that's a very committed agent, whereas anything lower than 1 is going to be basically not that, have a lower commitment. So that's the first point. So next thing that we're going to do is trustability. Now, here is where the cyber aspects of it come in. And so for every one of these agents, you basically monitor a whole bunch of features. Some of them are physical, and some of them are cyber. And so you monitor all of them, and that gives you a notion of how you and it's a classification problem. So these are the thresholds that tell you that these are the acceptable features and not anomalous. And if you violate that threshold, then you basically know that something is wrong. So you use the notion of machine learning, specifically federated learning, to basically collect all of the data and then basically calculate a specific trustability score. And in this thing, basically, there is a tolerance band. And so you monitor this non-anomaly ratio. And if you indeed do not go above a certain point, then you know that you have the trustability score will stop dropping. So you then use a historical record, and then you have rather this is when you can trust it because the non-anomaly ratio is high. So you have a current trust as well as a historical trust, and you have some sort of a weighted average to continuously update your trustability score. So you then use both of these things, and you have this weighted combination in order to compute a resilience score. And all of that goes into your optimization problem. So you then use then a hierarchical approach to solve this multi-objective problem, and you make sure that you successively optimize each one of these things in descending order of importance. And this basically gets around the issue that some of these are really not comparable in magnitude. So then we also have to pay attention to constraints. And the problem is more complicated because this is sandwiched between two levels. You have to obey your bosses, and you also have to take care of the people who are below you. So that makes it slightly more complicated. And that's what this is about. And so you take all of these power balance between the lower and upper levels, and they have to really match. And you also have to manage budgets. And you have to manage, of course, operating constraints. And all of these things are included in the overall optimization problem. So we took all of that, and we basically tested it in the context of the same 123 feeder, where we assumed that there were 3 separate feeders. And we basically did an actual load that we got, and the actual weather data from Boston, and realistic data for the reactive power and active power injections at each of these nodes. And nothing like this exists right now, and so we had to generate synthetic data. And we then randomly disaggregated the injections. But at the end of the day, going back to the big picture, what we really have is a way of having IoT-coordinated assets at the secondary level. And each of these SMAs basically provide that situational awareness of how much each of these nodes are able to inject. And we're also able to compute the resilience score whenever they depart from whatever they have cleared for, or when they have the trustability score violate, simply because there is an anomalous kind of a data that is, suddenly the traffic increases, then you know that something is going on. So you update all of these things, and then that gives you the resilience score, and ultimately that's what you have in the secondary market operator. So you can see that I can keep playing this game at all levels. And so at all levels, I basically have, therefore, from the top, the awareness, what's happening at the substation level, and the PMO has oversight over what's happening in their jurisdiction with situational awareness and resilience, and the same thing, the process repeats. So now I have a whole structure that gives me a distributed decision-making, gives me a way of monitoring resilience in this large-scale system. So let me take all of that and go back to my 2 problems that I mentioned, which is sort of like a mock MAD IoT attack and a mock Ukraine attack, and see what is it that we can do using the distributed decision-making and resilience approach. So let me first go back to the numbers here. And this is at the bulk level. This is at a transmission level. And this IEEE 39 node is over what is known as New England in the United States, which is about 7 states or so, Maine and Vermont and New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, et cetera, et cetera. So there is a lot of homes in there. And so if you look at the total number of homes, and you basically break this down, disaggregate it down into the distribution grid level, the final number that you walk away with, remember I showed you 123 feeder, there are 170 IEEE feeders per node, and there are 39 of these. So if you disaggregate it, then it becomes 67 kilowatts. So attacking 450 megawatt at this level is equivalent to 67 kilowatts at this lower level. Now, you could ask the question, gee, how do you know that the attack is disaggregated uniformly like that? Well, you don't. But let's suppose it's very non-uniform. The more non-uniform it is, the harder it is for the attacker to remain stealthy. So in fact, the most damage that they can do is if it's uniformly distributed. So this is a worst-case attack in some sense, and therefore we're going to focus more on what happens here. So let me then walk you through how we actually simulated this attack. So we assumed that all of these nodes were attacked. This could be because they all have installed the rooftop solar from the same company, and you inject the malware, and so you're really affecting all of those states, those nodes simultaneously. So then, essentially, what happens is that there is a total generation before, and it drops by about 67 kilowatts. And so to really look at it pictorially, these are all the different feeders. This is what it was before the attack, and they all drop down to 0 after the attack. So what is it that you do? So in this particular case, what we did was to say, hey, this PMO, remember the primary market operators sitting here, they have jurisdiction over all of these nodes, and they have awareness, right? And so there are all of these other flexible consumption nodes, and the market structure has provided the operator with an oversight over what all of those nodes are doing. And all of these are flexible consumption nodes. It's about 30 kilowatts in here of flexible consumption. So you basically carry out an optimization algorithm. Remember, they've all bid to make sure that they have a flexibility limit. You leverage that, and then you basically are able to utilize their consumption. You don't go to the centralized bulk power, but you locally manage resilience by appealing all of those nodes to adjust their consumption. Very simple idea, but it's something that happens because of distributed decision-making and coordination and control. So what is then done is that each of these nodes that are sitting in different places, I haven't indexed it here, but if needed, that we can go back into that. But you can see that all of those blue guys have dropped to the green level. So everybody does a little bit. Now, more to this. So let's go zoom in on how exactly is that reduction in the consumption happen. Remember that there is that lower level that is sitting below. Each of these SMOs have, let us say, 3 different feeders. And these 2 feeders are all load nodes, whereas this one is PV generation. Let's take a look at what they're doing. So now if you look into that, there are 3 SMAs. So before the attack, this is basically what they were producing. And this shaded region is the flexibility bid that they have, the range. So what does that mean? They are required to generate any value within that range. And basically, we utilize that to say, hey, I want you to basically consume less. Go down from here to here. Remember, this is negative. So that's what this is doing. And the same thing here, too. You go down, you consume less. And here, this is generation, this positive. So it's already very close to the limit, but you try to get them to generate just a little bit more. But the key thing here is that they're all trustable. And you have your trustability score that you've been monitoring. So you're only asking those that are more trustable to do more. So that's also already weaved into the optimization problem that we solve. So we do all of that, and we are able to, therefore, get resilience from these guys, and we are able to produce the kind of consumption, kind of net reduction that we want. So the summary here is that 67 kilowatt net generation is compromised. The PMO alerts the other trustable SMOs, and basically they provide the correct set points, and you're able to thwart this so-called mad IoT attack. So that's illustration number 1. Illustration number 2, remember that the Ukraine attack is a large scale. It's not only attacking the load nodes at the bottom, but it's also attacking all of the operators. So we took this problem, which is known as a 2-area interconnection. It's known as a 2-area Kundur model. Those of you who know power systems in the audience will know very well as to what this is. So this is basically 2 different areas, and there is a big load that is being served in both of those areas. And so what we're going to introduce is an attack in area 2, so that a percentage of all of the distributed energy resources in this area is assumed to be attacked. And so the idea there, remember, that's what was done in the Ukraine attack, where 3 distribution companies were attacked, and they happen to be also ones that provided key oversight. And again, we'll see how to sort of emulate that kind of an attack as we go forward. And remember that each one of these things, these loads, because they're large, I showed you 123 feeders. So this one corresponds to something like 200, and this one corresponds to about 400. So we then basically took a look at what's happening. So let's zoom in a little bit more and see what's going on in this area too. And so this is a lot of active power, and there is capacitive reactive power and inductive reactive power. And so now if you zoom in, remember what I told you earlier. The harder problem to solve is one where you're not uniformly, where the attack is uniformly distributed. So we're going to uniformly disaggregate this big attack into all of the little feeders. So essentially, if I could go back, every one of these feeders is assumed to be attacked a little bit. And that's the one where the attacker can remain stealthy and do a lot of damage, okay? So that's what you don't want, you want to prevent from happening. So if you're going to zoom into this and look at what's happening at all of these SMOs, a whole bunch of, in fact, 4 of them are attacked. That's what it corresponds to. So with this large-scale attack, essentially what the PMO does is it basically broadcasts, it realizes that something is wrong. Again, we'll go into the details of exactly how it senses that. And it asks for all of the other SMOs to basically come to the rescue. And they're able to provide, again, local resilience despite the magnitude of the attack. So let's go into, and remember, that, how does that do it? That SMO itself has all of these secondary market agents. And so they're going to basically all either up their generation or reduce their consumption or whatever they need to do. And the fact that you've got a distributed layer of information processing and decisions allows you to do that. So let's go into the details of how we actually do it. So that's the attack. And so we have, across all of the 441 feeders, 575 kilowatts is compromised. And so this is the total amount of internal generation. This is before the attack, and so it drops, obviously, after attack by that much. So then, if you look at the corresponding, remember the way power physics is set up, automatically the whole system is interconnected, and you draw more power from the bulk. And that's what happens here. So this goes up. Now, if this goes up and already the grid is stressed, you're in trouble, right? So then you want to make sure that appropriately the power that you're drawing is not going to cause extra damage and the grid doesn't go into a cascading failure. So what happens here is that you then, so again, because the system is highly interconnected, what happens is that the frequency starts to drop and it starts to deviate. So then the primary market operator notices this increase in the power exchange and then redispatches the remaining SMOs. And because of the redispatching, basically the mitigation part comes into the play. And you basically are able to reduce the power back that you're drawing from the external grid, and your frequency basically comes back into equilibrium. And so this is really what happens. Now, there's more details in here, and those of you who know power systems will probably have already noticed it. So there is this notion of primary control and secondary control that works so beautifully in a power grid. And primary control is basically one that you all have read in your undergraduate textbooks of James Watt and the flyball governor. It's basically a mechanical feedback system that basically automatically provides right kind of correction and provides damping. And it basically reduces the oscillations. That's primary control. Then there is other fantastically beautiful thing called AGC, which is integral control. And what that does is it brings the steady state error back to 0. That's it. These are the two very simple ideas that we know from our undergraduate days, and that works in this huge large-scale system called the power grid. So if you notice in here, that's exactly what's happening. Those oscillations are reduced, but there is a tiny bit of offset. However, that offset basically gets reduced because you have the right kind of control action that goes in, and we didn't have all of those control pieces in here. Before I go to that, let me just show you, okay, how did you actually do this correction? And that you're able to do this correction because all of these SMOs, if you look in more closely, some of them are attacked, remember? So now if you go into the details, then each of those SMOs basically do ask for their individual agents to provide some sort of a correction. And so this is the original bit, the blue, and they all basically adjust a little bit or increase a little bit as here they reduce the consumption, and here too they decrease the generation and so on. And this is how they're able to mitigate the attack. So now, what we really want to also do is to make sure whatever we are plotting here is indeed what happens, because we didn't have any of the fast time scales integrated into our simulation experiment. So now I'm going to go into the details of what's known as RTDC, and our collaborator basically was able to simulate this at a very high fidelity by introducing all of the different components that are needed in order to show how DERs all talk to each other, have the right type of handshake, and also go into the details of the DER models and actually include the DER physics into exactly how, when a set point change occurs, how they respond. So we basically did that, and here is the exact frequency response that happens. And so here is where the grid edge devices are, there's a big load disturbance. And remember, this is above the order of 575 kilowatt, which is a total of 254 megawatts. And that introduces oscillations, and this is where the primary control comes in. And there is a frequency, but the frequency settles down with a little bit of an offset. And then you have the remaining SMOs dispatched, and it basically goes back up to 60 hertz slowly. And I haven't simulated the whole thing, but if you let it run, that's what happens. So what this basically shows is that we can indeed take a look at a large-scale attack like the Ukraine attack, and then compromise a whole number of feeders that are sitting here at different levels, and all of the other nodes that basically come to the rescue. So I probably didn't go into the details of what exactly this Eureka is. This is efficient, ultra-resilient internet, IoT-coordinated assets. Efficient, ultra-resilient, IoT-coordinated assets. So all of these, through the distributed decision-making, come to the rescue, and they're all trustable because we have a trustability score assigned to each one of them. And because we are able to bring everything together, we are able to have those other SMOs in here, which are all the Eureka mitigation nodes, provide the correct set points, and those set points then give you a way of maintaining regulation. And what I've showed you let me go back in here. And so, So the high fidelity platform basically has a whole ways of modeling PV things. I don't think here we used any kind of wind power resources. It was mainly rooftop solars. We had a bunch of batteries in there, so those are included as well. And some of them are, I don't know if there is a particular cartoon that shows that there are also some flexible consumption devices that were HVAC that we included. And the nice thing about it is that all of these models have run at a very small time scale, so that we are indeed able to incorporate all of the transients that occur, because the assumption, everything that I've talked to you about, is one of optimization. So that basically says that if I can compute the set points, whatever is happening at the lower level in terms of distributed control can indeed follow the set points faithfully. That, of course, is an assumption, so that's what we are testing in here and going through all of the details in terms of the timescales to see that is what actually is happening. And that's what this is saying, and you can see the details of the primary control, and this is where you see the secondary control, and I mean, not through AGC, but essentially through power balance, and you can see that the frequency is on its way to correction. So we were able to show then that these trustable SMOs do provide the correct set points, and the frequency regulation is maintained, and the validation is using a high fidelity simulator. And so now with this, I hope I've been able to convince you that The electricity grid is an engineering marvel, but it is undergoing a major transformation in order to address climate crisis. And it does require diverse assets, tight coordination, and it's vulnerable to cyber attacks and various kinds of cyber attacks. The control provides valuable tools for mitigation, but the large-scale attacks do require new solutions. And the proposed approach here is to use a framework that includes the market as a substrate and allow distributed decision-making and leverage diverse assets, and it leverages the computation of trustability and resilience scores. And I wanted to walk you through 2 large-scale attacks that shows that in both of those cases, control, when employed correctly with the optimization at the higher end, is able to actually provide resilience that you're looking for. So I would really like to acknowledge my team, and they're the ones who did all the hard work. I just come here to have fun and talk to you about it. Priyank Srivastava is going to be a faculty member in IIT Kanpur. Vineet, who's a PhD student, who will be finishing in a couple of years and will, I'm sure, be looking for a job. Rabab graduated and is now a postdoc at Georgia Tech. And Venkatesh Ramanan is a former postdoc of mine who's at NREL, who helped us with the simulations. The work was funded by US Department of Energy, various projects, MIT Energy Initiative, as well as the US National Foundation. And I'd really like to acknowledge all of the collaborators who are listed in here, including Julio, who's in the audience. So that basically is what I wanted to talk to you about. Arigato gozaimasu.
So thanks very much, Anu, for this most stimulating and interesting talk. As you all know, each conference day has a theme. Today is Decarbonized Society, and I think this was an excellent start into that day, showing us what control can contribute to this important topic. Unfortunately, we have no more time for questions, but Dr. Annaswamy told me she is, of course, available here if somebody wants to talk to her, and I highly encourage you to do so. But before we go into the break, the General Chair would like to make an announcement. But let's thank Dr. Annaswamy once more.